It started with 4 words that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow changed everything. 4 words that sliced through 30 years of silence, obedience, and carefully rehearsed politeness. Why would he apologize for a lie? The room didn't explode. No one screamed. No glass shattered. But something far more dangerous happened. The illusion cracked. And once that crack appeared, everything Kody Brown had spent decades building began to collapse under its own weight. For years, viewers of Sister Wives believed they were watching the slow unraveling of a complicated family. Miscommunication, hurt feelings, different personalities, maybe even good intentions gone wrong. But what the season 20 tell-all revealed wasn't confusion. It was design. Not chaos, but control. And the most chilling part was realizing that Kody's apology tour, the thing that looked like growth, was actually the final evolution of his manipulation. When Kody Brown announced he was going on an apology tour, it sounded almost noble. A man humbled, a patriarch finally reflecting, a husband admitting failure. He would sit down with his ex-wives, look them in the eye, and own his mistakes. Years of emotional neglect, favoritism, financial decisions that left women stranded while he and Robin thrived. On the surface, it looked like accountability, like closure, like the ending viewers had waited for. But real accountability doesn't feel rehearsed. And it doesn't arrive with perfect timing. Kody didn't apologize when the damage was happening. He didn't apologize when Meri's money was tied up in land she couldn't access. He didn't apologize when Janelle was begging for progress while watching years of her financial future sit frozen in dirt. He didn't apologize when Christine realized she would never be loved the way she deserved. No. He waited until the family had already collapsed, until the land was already sold, until the consequences were safely in the past. That's when the apologies began. And that's where Meri Brown believed something had finally changed. When Kody called her to apologize for the so-called backdoor deal, secret conversations about selling Coyote Pass without her consent, Meri did what she had done for 30 years. She assumed good faith. She believed that honesty, even late honesty, still counted for something. He hadn't been forced to confess. No one had confronted him. He volunteered the information. And for a woman who had spent decades starving for scraps of emotional truth, that felt like progress. But what Meri didn't see, what she couldn't see yet, was that the confession itself was the weapon. That's where Jenn Sullivan comes in. Jenn wasn't raised inside the Brown family's emotional ecosystem. She didn't absorb the unspoken rules. She hadn't been trained to smooth things over, soften language, or protect Kody's image at all costs. She wasn't conditioned to believe that peace mattered more than truth. She was an outsider. And outsiders notice patterns insiders are trained to ignore. So when Meri described Kody's apology during the tell-all, Jenn did nod. She didn't smile politely. She didn't accept the narrative at face value. She stopped the story with a question that exposed the rot underneath everything. Why would he apologize for a lie? At first, it sounded almost simple. Almost too simple. If the backdoor deal never happened, if it was just talk, just an idea that never materialized, then why confess it at all? Why bring it up now? Why volunteer information that made him look bad when the sale was already done and the money already distributed? And that's when the realization hit. Not just Meri, but everyone watching. Because Kody wasn't apologizing for what he did. He was apologizing to control how Meri understood what Janelle did. The timing wasn't accidental. The confession didn't come before negotiations, when it could have changed outcomes. It didn't come during the conflict, when it could have forced transparency. It came after everything was finalized, when all that remained was perception, memory, blame. By confessing privately to Meri, Kody planted an idea that would linger long after the conversation ended. Janelle wanted to sell the land without you. I didn't want to, but she pushed me. I almost did something terrible, but I stopped myself. See how honest I'm being? It was brilliant in the worst possible way. Because now, even if Meri tried to trust Janelle, the seed was there. And once suspicion takes root, unity becomes impossible. This wasn't remorse. It was preemptive damage control. And Jenn saw it instantly. She pointed out what no one else had dared to say out loud. If the deal never happened, then the confession served only one purpose: to throw Janelle under the bus before Janelle could tell her side first. It wasn't about clearing a conscience. It was about winning a narrative race. For decades, Kody had survived by making sure his wives never fully aligned. As long as they doubted each other, they would never compare notes, never pool resources, never recognize patterns, never realize that the problem wasn't each other. And now, even divorced, he was still doing it. The metaphor that surfaced during the tell-all, the bus, was almost too perfect. Who threw who under it first? Who was driving? Who got crushed? But the darker truth was this: Kody wasn't just throwing people under the bus. He was making sure someone else held the steering wheel. By framing himself as the reluctant participant, Kody achieved several things at once. He looked honest. He looked reflective. He looked like a man brave enough to admit uncomfortable truths. At the same time, he subtly painted Janelle as aggressive, impatient, willing to hurt Meri to get her money faster. And perhaps most importantly, he avoided real accountability. Because technically, he could say nothing happened. But the conversations did happen. And that's the part he hoped everyone would forget. Months earlier, long before the apology tour, Kody had admitted on camera that there had been almost a backdoor deal with Janelle. His words, unprompted. He acknowledged discussing selling the land without Meri and Robin's consent. Janelle confirmed he had the legal authority to do it. Not hypothetically, legally. The plan didn't fail because Kody had a moral awakening. It failed because Robin objected. Because it would make them look bad. That distinction matters. Because now, Kody was reframing history. He was presenting himself as the man who considered wrongdoing, but ultimately chose the high road. He was apologizing for thoughts, not actions, while ignoring the real harm he did cause. Years of delays, financial instability, power imbalances, and intimidation tactics like trying to force Meri into signing an NDA. That's not growth. That's revisionism. And Jenn wasn't letting him get away with it. As the tell-all continued, it became clear that Jenn wasn't just defending Meri. She was dismantling an entire system. She named the pattern Kody had relied on for decades: keep the wives suspicious, keep himself central, and then blame whoever reacted. He did it when they were married. He's doing it now that they're divorced. And for the first time, Meri was starting to see it. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in the quiet way realizations actually happen. And once that realization settled in, it refused to stay quiet. Because when you start pulling on one loose thread in a story like this, the entire fabric begins to unravel, and Meri was finally brave enough to keep pulling. What made Kody's strategy so dangerous wasn't just that it manipulated the past, but that it poisoned the future. By confessing privately to Meri, he didn't just explain history, he rewrote relationships. Suddenly, every interaction Meri had ever had with Janelle felt suspicious. Every disagreement felt intentional. Every moment of tension now carried a new story attached to it, one Kody had carefully authored. And that is the genius of manipulation done well. You don't have to lie outright. You just have to control interpretation. Jenn understood this instinctively. She didn't argue facts at first. She didn't recite timelines or quote episodes. She attacked the logic itself. If this was really about honesty, why now? If this was really about remorse, why did it only damage one person's reputation while preserving his own? And if this was really about growth, why did it leave Meri feeling more isolated than before? The more Jenn spoke, the more uncomfortable the room became. Because what she was saying wasn't emotional. It was clinical. She was dissecting behavior the way a surgeon dissects tissue, exposing patterns that could no longer be unseen once identified. And then the conversation shifted to something even more revealing: the pattern. Kody Brown didn't invent this tactic during the apology tour. He perfected it over 30 years. He always thrived in the space between his wives, in the gaps where communication failed and assumptions flourished. When one wife was hurt, he framed it as another wife's fault. When one demanded fairness, he labeled her difficult. When one pulled away, he called her disloyal. And every time, He positioned himself in the center, the exhausted mediator, the misunderstood patriarch doing his best in impossible circumstances. It worked because none of the wives ever had the full picture. Christine didn't know what Kody told Meri. Meri didn't know what he told Janelle. Janelle didn't know what he promised Robin. Each woman believed she was reacting to reality, when in truth, she was reacting to a curated version of it. And Kody made sure those versions never aligned. Jenn named it out loud during the tell-all, and suddenly everything snapped into focus. This wasn't dysfunction. It was divide and conquer. And the proof was right there in Coyote Pass. The land wasn't just property. It was leverage. It was power frozen in dirt. And Kody structured that power so that it flowed through him and him alone. The deeds, the authority, the ability to stall or accelerate the sale, all of it centralized. That meant every wife had to negotiate through him. And negotiations done in isolation always favor the person in the middle. Janelle saw it eventually. That's why she hired a lawyer. Not to manipulate, not to scheme, but to protect herself after years of watching nothing move while her future remained locked away. And that decision alone was enough for Kody to frame her as aggressive, as someone forcing his hand, as someone making things difficult. But Jenn asked the question no one else would. Is hiring a lawyer manipulation, or is it what you do when someone with power refuses to act? The answer was obvious and uncomfortable. Janelle wasn't trying to hurt Meri. She was trying to get unstuck. She was trying to reclaim years of financial contributions that had been sitting idle while Kody and Robin lived comfortably. She acknowledged legal realities because ignoring them wouldn't make them disappear. And yes, she was frustrated. But frustration after years of delay isn't villainy. It's inevitability. Yet Kody took that frustration and reshaped it into motive. He framed it as greed, as impatience, as willingness to betray a sister wife. And because he told that story first, privately, emotionally, under the banner of apology, it stuck. That's when Meri started to realize something that made her stomach drop. If Kody could do this now, after the marriages were over, what had he done while she was still inside it? That question haunted every moment that followed. It was there when the host asked about Robin's role. It was there when Jenn was asked whether Robin was submissive. And when Jenn answered without hesitation, yes, and that it works for Kody, the room shifted again. Because submission, in this context, wasn't weakness. It was compatibility with control. Kody's reaction said everything. The anger, the defensiveness, the way his face hardened when the narrative slipped from his grasp. He lashed out not because Jenn was wrong, but because she had named something he depended on. Robin didn't challenge him the way the others eventually did. She didn't disrupt the hierarchy, and that made her safe. Jenn wasn't attacking Robin as a person. She was identifying a dynamic. And Kody knew that once viewers understood that dynamic, the entire structure of his justifications collapsed. Because if Robin thrived under his control, then the problem was never that the other wives were difficult. The problem was that they were human. The tell-all kept peeling back layers, and with each one, Meri looked less like the difficult wife she'd been labeled and more like a woman who had been slowly trained to doubt herself. 30 years of being told her feelings were wrong, that her expectations were unreasonable, that wanting clarity made her demanding, that asking for fairness made her unsafe. Jenn's presence shattered that conditioning. You could see it in the moments when Meri hesitated, when she swallowed words she wasn't sure she was allowed to say. And you could see it even more clearly when Jenn said them for her, loudly, without apology, without fear of being bleeped. That anger didn't come out of nowhere. It came from witnessing injustice clearly for the first time. And once Meri saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The coaching sessions earlier in the season suddenly took on new meaning. What looked playful at first, practicing assertive phrases, laughing through discomfort, was actually revolutionary. Because for Meri, saying, "Where's my money?" wasn't just a sentence. It was an act of rebellion against decades of emotional training. And that training ran deep. Meri admitted that even imagining confrontation made her anxious. That's not personality. That's conditioning. That's what happens when every attempt to assert yourself is met with punishment, withdrawal, or blame. And Jenn knew that the only way to break it was repetition, permission, validation. Each phrase they practiced chipped away at the lie that Meri was the problem. And as Meri grew stronger, Kody grew more exposed. Because manipulation only works when the target doubts their own perceptions. The moment someone trusts themselves again, the entire system collapses. And that's exactly what was happening on that couch. The apology tour was supposed to rehabilitate Kody's image. Instead, it became evidence. Evidence of how carefully he selected his admissions. Evidence of what he refused to address. Evidence of how even his remorse was transactional. He apologized for considering harm, not for causing it. He apologized in ways that preserved his victimhood. By the time the tell-all reached its most volatile moments, the tension wasn't just thick. It was surgical. Every sentence felt like it carried weight. Every pause felt intentional. And Kody, sensing that the narrative was slipping away from him, did what he has always done when cornered. He changed the subject. It started subtly, a deflection wrapped in humor, a question framed as irony. "So, what is it?" he asked, smirking just enough to suggest confidence. "Am I Robin's puppet, or is she mine?" The line landed the way he intended it to, light, almost playful, a distraction meant to dissolve the seriousness of the accusation. But the problem with deflection is that it only works when people are still confused. This time they weren't. Jenn didn't bite. Neither did Meri. Because what Kody presented as a contradiction wasn't one at all. It was complexity. And complexity is something manipulators hate because it can't be flattened into a soundbite. Robin could be submissive in ways that served Kody while also being influential in moments that mattered to her. Those things weren't mutually exclusive. Power in dysfunctional relationships rarely is. But by pretending it had to be one or the other, Kody was doing what he always did, reducing reality until it fit his defense. The joke didn't land the way he hoped. Instead, it exposed something else. Panic. Because when someone who has controlled the story for decades suddenly realizes that people are comparing notes, their instinct isn't reflection. It's disruption. And that's when Robin reached for the oldest weapon in the room. The catfishing scandal. 10 years old. Long resolved. Long apologized for. Long weaponized. And yet, there it was again, dragged into the light not to clarify, but to distract. When asked why Meri didn't trust her, Robin didn't talk about recent behavior. She didn't address the land. She didn't explain her silence during the NDA attempt. She reached back into the past and pulled out Meri's deepest humiliation. It was a low blow, and everyone knew it, because the catfishing didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened when Meri was emotionally abandoned, isolated, and desperate for connection. It happened after years of neglect. And it happened in a family structure that punished vulnerability while demanding loyalty. Bringing it up now wasn't accountability. It was character assassination. Christine's response cut through the noise like a blade. This is exactly why our family broke apart. She wasn't talking about the scandal. She wasn't talking about the land. She was talking about the pattern. The refusal to take responsibility. The instinct to deflect. The willingness to weaponize pain instead of addressing harm. Christine saw it years ago. That's why she left first. She didn't wait for apologies. She didn't wait for understanding. She recognized the system for what it was and removed herself from it. And now, watching from the outside, she could see Kody repeating the same behavior with Meri and Janelle that he once used on her. Creating doubt. Redirecting blame. Making the women feel like they were the problem for reacting to a problem he created. That's when the story shifted again. Because it was no longer about whether the backdoor deal technically existed. It was about why the idea of it was useful. Jenn articulated it perfectly when she called it a ghost story. Not a lie exactly. Something worse. A half-truth designed to haunt. A narrative planted not to inform, but to scare. To keep people apart. To ensure that Meri and Janelle never sat down together and compared experiences. Never laid out numbers. Never asked why certain people always benefited more. Never realized that the imbalance wasn't accidental. Because if they did, the entire structure would collapse. Kody's worst nightmare wasn't bad press. It wasn't criticism. It wasn't even losing control over his wives individually. It was them uniting. Because unity turns confusion into clarity. And clarity is lethal to manipulation.
So he needed to prevent that at all costs.
And the apology was the perfect delivery system. It came wrapped in humility, in vulnerability, in apparent self-awareness. But beneath it was the same old tactic: divide, deflect, and dominate the narrative. Confess just enough to look honest. Admit thoughts, not actions. Frame yourself as tempted but virtuous. And always redirect suspicion outward. Janelle felt it immediately. That's why her denial in the tell-all sounded confusing to some viewers. There was no backdoor deal. On the surface, it contradicted what Kody had said on camera. But when you looked closer, it wasn't a denial of conversations. It was a rejection of framing. In Janelle's mind, a deal is something executed, something finalized, something real. And since the land wasn't sold without consent, she rejected the label. Not because nothing was discussed, but because she refused to let Kody redefine intent as outcome. And that distinction mattered. Because Kody was trying to use semantics to his advantage. If nothing happened, then nothing wrong occurred. If nothing wrong occurred, then any anger was unreasonable. And if anger was unreasonable, then once again, he was the victim. It was the same cycle, over and over. What made this tell-all different was that for the first time, the cycle was being named while it was happening. Not in hindsight, not in therapy sessions years later, but live in real time with someone who had no emotional investment in protecting Kody's ego. Jenn didn't soften her language. She didn't apologize for her anger. She didn't worry about being bleeped. She said the things Meri had been trained for decades not to say. And every time she did, you could see Meri straighten just a little, breathe a little deeper, take up a little more space. That's how change actually happens. Not in grand speeches, but in moments of permission. Meri had spent most of her adult life believing that wanting clarity made her difficult, that asking for fairness made her selfish, that reacting to neglect made her dramatic. And now, sitting next to someone who saw the situation clearly, she was finally being told the truth. She wasn't difficult. She was manipulated. She wasn't demanding.
She was deprived.
She wasn't wrong. She was lied to. And once those realizations settle in, they don't fade. They rearrange everything. Kody sensed it slipping. You could see it in the way his tone sharpened, in the way his jokes landed harder, in the way his defenses grew more erratic. Because for the first time, the women weren't just reacting to his words. They were analyzing his intent. And intent is where his entire strategy lived. The apology tour had failed. Instead of restoring his image, it exposed his methods. Instead of earning forgiveness, it documented manipulation. Instead of closing wounds, it revealed how deliberately they had been inflicted. And the most dangerous thing of all was that Meri was no longer questioning herself. She was questioning him. And once that door opens, it never closes again. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the room felt charged, almost electric. What viewers saw as tension and drama on screen was the culmination of decades of unseen battles. Kody Brown wasn't just facing the tell-all. He was facing truth itself, and for the first time, it didn't bend to his narrative. The weight of scrutiny, the questions, the piercing observations, all pressed against him like air leaking from a balloon. And the more he resisted, the more transparent his control tactics became. Every tactic he had used for 30 years, the subtle manipulations, the whispered half-truths, the emotional redirection, the feigned remorse, was now laid bare. His so-called apology tour, once framed as personal growth, had been nothing more than a calculated exercise in narrative control. By confessing to considerations instead of actions, by positioning himself as the reluctant participant while amplifying Janelle's role, by inserting Robin as the moral compass, he attempted to orchestrate perception rather than own responsibility. But perception, when challenged by clarity and courage, is fragile. Meri's transformation was now unmistakable. What had been decades of ingrained self-doubt and silent acquiescence was breaking away in real time.